You're a liar. Who was here? Who were you with?
I've worked with children, very young children, about the age of 12 to 18 months, who've witnessed the murder of their mother, who absolutely remember.
We've seen little ones who cry with tears but have no voice coming out because they are too frightened.
Many of these children actually often think they're going to be dead at a young age. Why is it that people never question why that may be?
For children, watching their mothers being attacked is just as disturbing as being actually attacked themselves.
You're a liar.
Children who experience cumulative harm, such as violence, something different happens. The brain becomes preoccupied with survival.
Up to 80% of our brain develops within the first 2 years of life, more than 90% by our 3rd birthday. In these critical early years, all the experiences we have, both positive and negative, play a vital part in shaping the neurological structure of our developing brain. And that affects our learning capacity, our behaviours, our physical, emotional and mental health.
So we think about the first 3 years of life, which is when the brain is growing at its most rapid rate, really as a foundational period. So a lot of the wiring, a lot of the connections between nerve cells that we need for healthy functioning are literally laid down during those rapid periods of growth. We're essentially born with our full complement of neurons. What literally happens as a result of interaction or stimulation, so input, is the development of connections, which are called synapses between nerve cells. Pathways that are about regulating feelings, pathways that are about understanding human interaction, attention, learning, memory. All these pathways are literally laid down like railway tracks in the first 3-4 years of life.
The most frequently used connections grow stronger and work more efficiently, while the lesser used remain underdeveloped or disappear.
So early infant brain development is very much shaped by the quality of emotional interaction between the parent or carer and the infant. And in healthy situations, there are sharing of positive emotional interactions, if you like, so positive emotional states between the parent and the infant.
Attachment bonding happens as the parent becomes attuned to the baby and the baby becomes attuned to the parent. And we want there to be, we kind of create a rhythm between the parent and the child, sometimes referred to as serve and return.
What happened? Yeah, what happened? What's happening today?
So the baby serves to the parent a smile. Makes a googling sound. The parent returns something. What they return is, "Oh, you're so cute. Oh, I love it when you make that noise." And the baby kind of begins to smile and and in the smile, they again serving back up something to the parent, and the parent responds. So there's a serve and return, but like a tennis match, I suppose. At that moment, the baby is learning about this thing called attachment. It's absolutely critical for them to be able to thrive.
What we know from neuroscience about how our brains learn is that we have this system called the reticular activating system that sits down the bottom part of our brain. It's part of our primitive brain. And what happens there is all our senses have all this information from our ears and our eyes and our smelling, and all that information comes in through there. And what happens is it's like a big sifter. And in this sifter, the information comes through. Some stays in the sifter, but about 2,000 bits come through the sifter. When it comes through the sifter, it goes to our amygdala, and our amygdala decides whether that information is safe or not.
The amygdala is that part of our brain that regulates emotions. If it perceives a threat, it can send a rush of adrenaline into the body, which in turn triggers a flight or fight response, putting us on high alert. Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. Loud noises, angry voices, sudden movement can all trigger a stress response in a child.
We have a very immediate and acute response that allows us to, if you like, prepare ourselves for either fight or flight. So we have that surge of adrenaline that allows us to increase our blood sugars so we have energy, to direct blood to our muscles so we can run away if we can. Young infants don't have that fully developed response, so they're more vulnerable to stress. They will still have a cortisol or adrenaline reaction, but it's less regulated.
If the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal.
Stop it! Oh, let me go! Stop it! Oh!
If the brain becomes preoccupied with survival because of violence, that is, it no longer is it really focused on thriving, it's preoccupied with survival, just getting through the day because of the violence that's happening around the child. Something different, these neural networks start to become compromised. Because the brain says, forget about counting, that's not going to help you to survive, you don't need that. And those neural networks begin to break away. What the child says is you might need to be more aware of your environment. Now, how do you be more aware of your environment? Become hypervigilant.
So it's very much the model of sometimes what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. So the infant who's terrorised or traumatised excessively in the early years has those mechanisms very much primed to respond later on, in the similar way that the Vietnam veteran back from the war has the fully blown trauma response to something that reminds them of that trauma or triggers. We understand that survivors of early child abuse and trauma have precisely the same sort of mechanisms. So they're more likely to have fully fledged anxiety responses, self-protective or dissociative responses, a whole range of difficult behaviours.
Look at me. What do you do all day? Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're a liar.
Stop it!
You're a liar. Who were you with?
Stop
Talk to
hurting
me.
Let me...
The infant brain is very sensitive, particularly to stress-related hormones. So what we're studying is the impact of high levels of cortisol essentially on the way the brain grows. And there's been quite a lot of work showing that to all intents and purposes there are very potentially long-term, if not permanent, effects of cortisol on brain development, both brain structure, in other words, the way the brain grows, and also brain functioning, the way the brain operates. So we see some parts of the brain which are very sensitive to the effects of these stress-related hormones that are literally smaller. The cases that we're talking about where brain development is impacted by poor environment are usually either situations of neglect, fear, unresolvable fear, where they can't escape from a traumatising situation, or where there's chronic patterns of really dysfunctional relating where the child is not understood.
You know, for some children though, they might, who withdraw in particular, they don't want to know about all that stuff. They don't want to be hypervigilant, because when you're hypervigilant, you see the pain of what's going on around you. Maybe what they want to do is just pretend it's not happening, just deny it all. And the neural networks, instead of being hypervigilant, they might become hypovigilant. They just stop assessing that stuff because there's nothing they can do about it. They feel helpless. So I just withdraw from it all.
In relationships where things are not going so well, which we would see with a very traumatised parent, for example, they may have difficulty in reading and responding to the emotional signals of the infant, not quite understanding. So the infant might then have the experience of not being understood. And that feeling of having one's communication validated or being understood, having the parent give that back, reflect that back to the infant, is very crucial for early development.
When we think about attachment, it's absolutely critical for healthy development. As human beings, we need the experience of attachment with another significant other. You know, as an infant, you don't survive if you don't have a primary figure to help you do that, a mother, father, so forth. It's that attachment that helps the child to go out and kind of explore the world and be curious about the world. If that is compromised, it is absolutely going to compromise the child's ability to develop, to thrive.
You're a liar. Who was here? Who were you with? Who else?
If a child has been exposed to quite disturbed relationships or has grown up looking at the abuse of power as being a core element of relationships, or seen relationships only through the lens of victims and perpetrators, then literally that child takes that on board or incorporates that as their understanding of what human interaction is.
Children actually will learn from those closest to them.
Liar. You're a liar.
So in the face of conflict or an argument, the response is to hit out. Why would you assume that a 6 or 7-year-old wouldn't do the same?
Some of these children are very traumatised, some of these children are very depressed, some of these children are highly anxious.
They might be attempting to create chaos in the classroom, or chaos in the playground, or chaos at home. What they're really doing is communicating that they don't feel safe.
We have to understand that just because you don't have a bruise or a fracture doesn't mean that you're not impacted by family violence. And as a child you are. Infants are particularly vulnerable to domestic violence because we know that in the first year of their life they learn about 50% of their lifestyle areas that develop in their brain, and we do see that a lot of these children, a lot of these infants are quite passive. They are often quite silent. One little infant who comes to mind, it was a very, very violent situation, and the father would get very cross with the mum if the baby cried, and she had a number of other children, so this baby was just constantly propped up in the pram, and the back of her head was very flat because she just hadn't been taken out of the pram. She was fed to actually keep her quiet, so that she was quite able at a very young age to actually sit with her arms out, and they propped the bottle in her mouth and she could move it back and forth to keep it in her mouth, and she knew that was for her survival.
Generally speaking, children will either externalise their behaviours or they will internalise their behaviours. Either they're implosive or explosive. Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a leading researcher, talks about the dissociation and hyperarousal continuum. Dissociation is when a child shuts down in some way, emotionally, physically, behaviourally. Hyperarousal is when kids tend to be aggressive, not able to concentrate in class, end up being kind of behaviourally disrupted and therefore often in the principals or excluded. Across ages and stages of development, the child will show these behaviours in different ways. So when you, for example, look at an infant, and you're looking at an infant who's exposed to family violence, you're not going to be seeing kind of the behavioural disturbance that you'll see for a 5 or 6-year-old. What you'll be seeing is either a really grisly child who's really not able to settle very well, maybe colicky, not able to be soothed through the comfort of a mother-child relationship, maybe showing kind of rocking and excessive kind of motor movements, so they're kind of really agitated and moving constantly. If they're dissociative, these are the babies, and these are the ones I tend to worry about the most because we don't pick them up very well, is a shutdown response. non-responsive to social cues, not able to actually respond to someone calling out their name, not showing a smile when someone smiles at them, basically sleeping for lots and lots of hours, and someone saying to me, oh, this baby's really, really good, they really sleep well and they're really settled, and I'm thinking they can't be exposed to family violence and be doing this.
The problem is if you experience stress and you can't resolve it, either because you don't have the capacity to, you don't have the skills to, or somebody's more powerful than you, is that you still have the stress response. When that stress response is not resolved, then it can create havoc within the body, the physiology of the body. It can create havoc in the psychology of the mind. So we might have children under constant stress, in a classroom as an example, who, because they're under stress, they're trying to resolve the stress. And the way of resolving that might be to say to a teacher, I need help, or I'm feeling scared. But they don't have the language to say that. They don't know how to say that. So what do? They turn a table upside down. They try and make a joke. They try and distract other kids. They go out into the playground, and although they would like to play with the child, they don't know how to do that. So what do? They might hit a child when what they really want to say is, I'd like to play with you. Again, they don't know how to do that. They don't have the language with which to say, I feel this, or I feel that, or I want to do this.
And what will often happen is because people don't understand the context around what's happening to the child and what's happened to them developmentally and what they've been exposed to, these children will be seen as bad. They won't be seen as sad, and they won't be seen as frightened, and they won't be seen as alarmed or terrorised. So when a child somehow is playing with another child, they will perceive the taking of the block often as a threat. And what will initiate is their fight, flight, freeze response. Their threshold's lower, and then they'll lash out because their threshold's lower. And don't forget too, that often lashing out is also been modelled and it's been learnt.
When we're working with children that are very traumatised or very reactive, it is very easy to ourselves want to try and step in with authority and control because it almost invites that response. One of the things is that it's easy to mirror someone else's behaviour, and that means you can mirror the child's behaviour as well, so that if they're out of control, it's easy for us to mirror and feel out of control as well.
What normally happens is that when a child acts out or even withdraws, in those first 0 to 3 seconds, we have an adult that thinks, I have to get control and power over this child who's trying to be disobedient, and they'll tend to be reactive. It's that reaction that's almost like putting fuel on the fire.
She knocked all the stuff over.
Often the primary question that occurs in a mental health service around an infant, a child or an adolescent who presents is, what is wrong with the child? As I always say to my colleagues and others, it's much more important to ask what has happened to the child. If we can understand what has happened to a child, we can then actually think about what we're seeing in front of us.
So if a child, for example, is highly anxious, they will have difficulties in concentrating. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disease such as ADHD, which is thought to be a neurological disorder. So it's a very complex issue. It's quite useful to really examine children's behaviours quite closely, to do a thorough assessment and to say, yes, they can present with a range of difficulties. The issue is more as whether the labels are particularly helpful. They might be descriptive, but sometimes premature use of diagnostic labels stops people thinking. And it stops people thinking about the very important underlying issues which are to do with that child's experience, that child's history of being parented, that child's attachment history, and it stops us thinking about, well, what are the real anxieties for the child?
Well, the thing that we need to keep in mind in working with these children is that really our job is as a detective. In other words, there's clues, but how do we actually start to find out what the clues mean for the child?
Give it! Give it to me now!
Best way to approach a child throwing a tantrum, I think of the 3 to 8 seconds of therapeutic intervention, I call it. So number one is to ensure you're regulating your own emotional state. That's first. In those 3 to 8 seconds, you can also ask yourself, what's the